my first exposure to really both the left wing and parts of the far right. It took me, and the first Wobblies I met were all fans, Neil Rust and Orange Mike Lowry and all, and I've been finding that organizing fanish stuff and organizing anti-fascist stuff has got kind of an enormous amount in common, including the people involved, and it's been really interesting. But mostly, also, I was inspired to do this panel by the story of Leland Sapiro. Leland was a Los Angeles fan who one day decided he'd had enough. He was really irked at a New Orleans fan who kept writing really racist and anti-Semitic stuff. So he flew from Los Angeles to New Orleans, took a taxi to the Troll's house, rang the doorbell. Troll answers the door, and it was just like, was it the guys from Clerks who did that?
Yeah, Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back.
Yeah,
where they spent
yeah.
all the money they made on their comic book to go and beat up every single troll that commented on their forum post online.
Well, Leland was first. Troll answers the door, Leland decks him, turns around, gets back into the taxi that's waiting for him, goes back to the airport, and flies back to Los Angeles. And Colin found out something interesting. Leland Sapiro is probably a red diaper baby because his father, Aaron Sapiro, wound up suing Henry Ford for slandering him and other Jewish organizers, and won. He was actually organizing farmers rather than industrial workplaces, and he spent a lot of time in Saskatoon, which is where Colin's from. And so, Leland came by it honestly. But I'm hoping that, I'm going to get my fellow panelists to talk about this a bit, and then I'd be really, really interested in hearing stories from the audience.
Hello? Oh, all right. Mentioning Leland Sapiro, but as chance would have it, this copy of his fanzine is going to be in the auction in a couple of hours, and in his editorial, he blasts Sol Cohen, who of course was also Jewish, because at the time he'd just taken over publishing amazing and fantastic magazines and was reprinting old stories to which he believed he bought the reprint rights, which was which is why I was wishing that Ted White was here, because he would know all about it. But yeah, it goes on this. I'll just quote the last paragraph of his editorial here. Prejudice being what it is, one morally reprehensible act by a Jew injures the whole Jewish community, of which the present writer, like Sol Cohen, is a member. So yeah, he was obviously very much aware of prejudice and racist issues, and felt that that he had to chime in on this issue, which was a co-celebre of fandom of the day in the late 60s. But yes, the gentleman who got punched out by Sapiro, whose name was Edwin Siegler, was a notorious right-wing racist of the day, and he was not a very pleasant character, and I think the general reaction of fandom was that he got exactly what he deserved, because while Sapiro wasn't particularly popular and his fanzine was probably seen as a bit stuffy and rather circon, I think most people disliked Siegler, and that's telling, because fandom has pretty much always been more left-wing than right-wing. Obviously there's outliers in every direction because of the nature of any community, but if you go back to the 1930s, when fandom was just taking off, the Futurians in New York, Fred Pohl, Don Wollheim, Dot Lambs, all that mob, they were all as political as hell. They had two hobbies: founding and feuding science fiction fan clubs, and founding and feuding in political clubs. So you get Fred Pole founding the local branch of the Young Communist League, for instance, and then getting thrown out of it and going off to join the Farmer Labour Party or whatever fringe group it was called then. And to an extent, I think that level of activity has set the tune for fans and politics right from that day to this, that fans have always been politically aware and active, fans have always been more left-wing than right, and fans have always been prepared to do things, well, ask Lena Sapiro, and he's not the only example, though he is a well-known one, being prepared to sort of step in and actually get even physically active.
Yeah, it's funny because the story of Lena Sapiro going off and punching a Nazi was one of the first stories I actually learned in fandom, and mostly because I mentioned to someone, oh, thank you, I'm a fifth generation socialist, and which is not that rare in Latin America, but is very much in the upper Western world. And I've always found it interesting because of those I grew up with and the way I consume science fiction and fantasy, which my father immediately introduced me to Star Trek. It was just like this aligns with my family's political views, and basically it was just like, watch all of it. My mother used to keep a picture of herself to intimidate us, her sons, by it was as a teenage student union leader. She was in charge of the Maoist union in the country, in Panama, and it shows her standing on top of a burning car leading other students in riot. The riot's reason, they changed the color of the uniform. So, I always found it funny growing up in this environment, and also growing up in Texas, where everyone else around me was definitely in no way left-wing. So it was very surreal, but what's funny is probably out of almost any subculture I've been involved in, except the explicitly leftist ones, fandom and fanzine culture have felt politically at home in a sort of sense, in that I don't feel particularly ostracized whenever I voice some like whack job anarchist opinion. But in particular, I usually get about 5 people chiming in with me, and then about 3 of them arguing with me. But so I do find that fairly welcoming. I even took part in my own fanzine leftist action, in which me and my friend Glug put together one of the copies of Lake Geneva. I think the final one was basically lambasting the puppies. And Glug decided that he needed to read everything that John C. Wright had written in order to write an actual critique of John C. Wright, as opposed to just being like, well, his politics sucks, so he must suck. So what he did was what I call the most masochistic thing anyone has ever done, is he read every single word that John C. Wright had out publicly. And afterwards, he looked like the face of a dead and decomposing man. But he wrote this excellent critique, scathing, and John C. Wright basically sent it over to Vox Day, who then wrote a blog post basically insulting us, me and him. And, we felt we'd finally made it at that point. And we were just like, well, nothing's more coming out of this. Every now and then John C. Wright talks about how shitty Lake Geneva is. No one cares about fanzines anymore, blah, 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 blah. Except, he's constantly talking about it, so clearly he does. But I remember we're at the Sasquan, the Spokane Worldcon that was also on fire. And John C. Wright was there doing a coffee clutch. So Glug and I, we decide we're going to get our copy of Lake Geneva, and we're going to see if we can get him to sign it. And, okay, so we're there, we get to the coffee clutch, and him and his wife Yagi I forget what his wife's name is, but they were both nonstop talking in the most like egomaniacal sort of weird shit ways, talking about like his religious revival of like having a philosophical discussion with Jesus and stuff like that, and how he himself had discovered that his secular humanist views were completely wrong. And everyone around him was like a sycophant. It was just like these teenage white kids who were just like continuously like, yes, yes, of course, you know, this is absolutely correct. We totally agree with you. Yes, you know, they were like one step close, like one step away from calling him Mein Führer or something. But there was one moment where he just goes, yeah, I just want to break for a moment and talk about how, you know, there are people who slander me out there, and these people, you know, they just write horrible garbage zines, and there in particular is one called Lake Geneva, and Glug and I are doing like a secret handshake under a table in celebration, and it's just like, oh, just garbage. If I ever see those editors, don't worry, I would definitely just clock them in the face. And we just look at each other and we're like, he doesn't know. And so after listening to more of his drivel, at the end, we go up to him, and we had made a bet for who pays for lunch, which is if he signs the thing, you know, Glug's gonna pay for lunch, because I thought his ego would win over everything. Glug thought that no, the man clearly has some sort of fucked up principle, so that might win over. So he's not gonna sign the thing. Needless to say, all I had to do was present the zine and say, hey, could you sign this? It's making fun of the whole Hugo catastrophe. Specifically him, but I didn't mention that. And he goes, of course, I love signing things. And gigantic signature across the cover of this Lake Geneva. And of course, what I did is I brought it back to the fanzine lounge and put it on the rack with the other fanzines. And it's funny because I would see people pick it up and read through it and then see it was signed by John C. Wright.
But he signed the front cover. It says Lake Geneva on the cover, so
Yeah.
he knows what it is.
Yeah.
If he could be bothered to read it, yes.
Yeah. I mean, the way he literally signed this thing was just like, oh, of course, I would love to sign it. And he barely looked at it. And, you know, I could probably get this man to sign a copy of Mein Kampf, but like, he might be a fan though, but
I was gonna say, that would be easier.
yeah, that'd be easier. But yeah, get him to sign a check if he has any money. It was just surreal, and I think Jerry has that copy lying around in our archive somewhere, just because I never bothered to pick it up. I just wanted to do this particular thing. Afterwards, he thought that we were also sycophants, and I see him at the Hugo pre-reception. And he's just like, oh, a pleasure to see you here. It's always good to see another fan of mine here, you know, blah, 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 blah. Look at all these rockets I have on me. And I was just like, oh, you know, that's great. So in particular, John C. Wright's personal rival is George R. R. Martin. And so I was like, George, could you do something for me? Could we walk by John C. Wright and just wink at him? And we did this, and John C. Wright basically turned red with anger. And he just like looked at me directly at me and like shook his head. And the next thing I see is a tweet from John C. Wright just saying, there are people in the world who will betray you. So that's my own bit of fanzine leftist activism.
Please write us up as an article. It's too good.
I will. I definitely will.
I don't think, I was the one that printed the zines or donated the zines that were in the reading rack.
Yeah.
On most of them, but I don't remember seeing the Lake Geneva come back with me.
Okay, it went somewhere.
Somebody else
Yeah.
must have.
Yeah, somebody
And
wanted it.
Jerry had mentioned that
And you were
she
talking
had
about
it.
Jerry
Yeah.
Sullivan, but it was.
Yeah, well, because it showed up actually again at Mid-American.
Oh, well, maybe she
Yeah,
did then.
yeah, because I saw it there in the like short amount of time I wasn't bidding on the NASFIC, so
Okay.
it must be somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully one day it'll show up in auction here or something. Yeah.
So, some other cases of fans being overtly political in whatever regard. Campaign for nuclear disarmament, which got underway in the late 50s in Britain. Several fans were involved in the early demonstrations and marches by that. Most notably John Brunner, who at the time was selling professionally, but he was also still writing for fanzines too. He had a foot in both camps. Not only was on all the marches and that, but he actually composed the CND's theme song. I'm not certain whether it's still their theme song to this day, but certainly for a long time, the H-Bomb's Thunder by John Brunner was sung regularly at their events. And
He was a folk singer.
oh yeah, well, he was a folk singer and hung out with many other folk singers. He used to hold court in his London house, didn't he? Well, I think. Did you get to visit there in the 60s London World Con? I know he had held
Yeah,
court
he had
there.
a party there a day or so before the convention that quite a few of us went to.
And also from British fandom, another instance that comes to my mind, at the start of the 80s, the London fandom was perhaps a little more left-wing than it had been for a while due to some younger and sort of politically keen recruits. And Abby Frost and some of her buddies ran a campaign called Dupers for Poland, which was basically because Poland and under General Jaruzelski and that lot was in a rather precarious totalitarian state. Duplicators and printing presses were hard to come by the political left in Poland at the time, and I don't know whether that campaign ever actually managed to buy a duplicator and send it to anyone in Poland, but certainly it was intended seriously. I mean, coming along later, and when I first discovered it, I confess to my shame that I thought it was just a joke. But no, I do believe it was a serious and thought out political campaign by Abby Frost and Ross Caveney and Cyril Simpson and some of that London crowd. I don't know whether any of the longer standing British fans here know anything more about that. Oh well, but let the records show that it existed at any rate.
Well, I'd sort of semi-regaffiliated by then.
Dead air.
Oh, hey, we're being streamed right now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Since this is a really recent example, I'm not going to mention names, although if you come ask me afterwards, I'll be happy to. But the Soldiers of Odin are a Finnish neo-Nazi organization composed of people who have not read the Kalevala and don't know anything about Finnish culture, but they are actually Finnish. They got run out of Helsinki by fans. There's a big overlap between the Worldcon 75 committee and the people who organized the event that basically caused the Soldiers of Odin to give up on Helsinki. It turned, and I'm finding it, if you need a few hundred people to show up in a particular place at a particular time, because they all want to do approximately the same thing, running conventions, running counter demos, a lot of it's the same. And they did it, that was where it was founded, and that was the first place they got successfully no-platformed. And it was just as well because they'd already killed at least one person. And that's why I'm not naming names on the live stream, because I don't want to get our Finnish comrades in Finland in trouble with any remaining Soldiers of Odin.
Well, the stream will be unlisted, of course, but that doesn't necessarily...
You probably know more about this than me because you live here. I believe that the Toronto area furry fans have got all political lately. Because I believe their group has the same name as a far-right group, and they took exception to this and started campaigning. You probably know the story more than me.
Yeah, it's one province over. There are 4 groups in Quebec called La Mute.
Oh, Quebec, not Toronto, my mistake.
And La Mute means the pack, as in a wolf pack. There's a dog fanciers group. There's a neo-Nazi group. And there are 2 furry groups called Le Mute. One is anti-fascist and one is pro-fascist. The dog fanciers are really getting kind of frustrated because they keep getting the weirdest people wandering into their social media. But yeah, this is very much fighting it out in furry fandom. There's quite an issue with neo-Nazi and Confederate enthusiast furries showing up at events and, getting roundly castigated at a minimum by the other furries.
So which of them owns lemute.com?
That's a really good question. I bet somebody has Wi-Fi,
It's like-
is
like in-
online, I'm not.
Like in South Park when the North American Marlon Brando lookalikes are complaining that someone else got Nambla.com.
So, when you said Confederate enthusiasts, you're referring to the Confederate States of America. Why are they active in Canada? Did they justify their?
I'd mentioned I'd sort of segued from Quebec furries to furries in general.
Oh,
and
okay.
Also, the Confederate flag is used outside of the U.S. in places where displaying a swastika would be enough, and it's a deniable way of it's basically a deniable way of displaying that you're a white supremacist, and so that's why it's a thing outside the U.S.
Okay.
There are some other quasi-swastika symbols that the far right uses.
No, for sure. They'll turn a swastika into, they'll convert a swastika into anything, any
Like
sort of
a
geometric.
pair of lightning strikes,
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah, the SS lightning symbols. But I was also going to mention. So before I ended up getting involved on this side of fandom and fanzines and everything, I actually used to be heavily involved with steampunk sort of stuff. And Steampunk Magazine, which was the finest zine in the steampunk community, was actually started out as an anarchist zine. And you could buy glossy copies of it and everything like that, but it was always free on PDF online. And me and the editor of the zine, known by the great anarchist name of Magpie Killjoy, who is now actually a published author for Tor. We
Under
went.
that name?
What? Yeah, under Margaret Killjoy. Yeah, Margaret Magpie Killjoy. So we went on a road trip after I finished chairing a steampunk convention, and it was funny because they were just like, well, I need to go on a book tour to promote my latest anarchist book for AK Press. And I was just like, well, okay, great. I'm unemployed and young. I'm going to jump into your van. And so we went on this book tour that went all the way from my steampunk convention in San Antonio, Texas, to the Steampunk World's Fair in Piscataway, New Jersey. And it was fascinating because it was one of the most leftist experiences I've ever had combined with fandom, because we had to explain to people why we didn't have any casual clothes on throughout the road trip. And anarchists are well known for wearing just beat up clothing all the time. But we had just come from a steampunk convention, so we had 3-piece suits and all sorts of stuff. And along the way, it was a passing over of just here are some steampunk, fandom zines, and then they would trade us their anarchist zines and everything like that. So it was a lot of crossover of zine trading and everything like that. But along the way, we also ended up getting involved in protests, meeting people at squats and everything like that. And it was just really fascinating because they were just so wildly interested in learning more about science fiction conventions in general. Mostly because if you talk to a lot of anarchists, especially anarchists my age, they will claim that they were radicalized by some form of science fiction fantasy media or another, and their own interpretations of it. So, yeah, I mean, they count themselves as being fandom, but not necessarily being in fandom. And so, but yeah, we were able to convince people who I still see at Worldcons nowadays to show up to conventions just because of that road trip. So
why did they stop?
what?
You say they're not showing up now. Why?
No, they are. There's a few that show up to Worldcons. It's also, I guess, impending worldwide doom might keep them from conducting their hobbies and instead concentrating on their political action.
Okay.
But besides that, I mean, most of them still show up to either local conventions in Texas or wherever else we met them, or show up to the Worldcon. I know at least 3 of the people that I met along this road trip continuously have showed up to a Worldcon for the past 4 years. So yeah.
Well, Oh, I think Andy was
Yeah,
about.
just to elaborate on that, do you find that that's actually a common phenomenon, that you meet people in a variety of walks of life now who sort of, you know, disarmingly more about fandom than you expect them to?
Yeah.
I just find that fanish lore has kind of crept into all sorts of crevices where I never would have expected, and I meet people that I expect to be highly mundane, and they say John Singer says hi.
Oh, yeah. Oh, this has happened multiple times to me. I also think a part of it has to do, especially with like my generation in particular, that some of us had parents that were fans and just kind of gaffiated from fandom, but maintained the fandom lore and culture alive in the way they raised their kids. And so,
Like Chris Garcia.
yeah, like, exactly. Classic example. And like, I had a friend of mine who now lives in France, but he was raised basically by a very fanish father who still had like a collection of fanzines and everything. Back then, of course, I didn't care. I was a young teenage punk. But like, he had a whole bunch of fanish zines and a whole bunch of like program books from like almost every convention he went to, etc. And definitely raised my friend to be like exceedingly fanish without ever, like, he's never gone to a convention, but he's fanish. And like, when I mentioned, you know, oh yeah, I'm getting into fancy, he's like, oh, which ones, blah, 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 have you read the Enchanted Duplicator yet? And like, I'm just like, how the hell you know about that? Yeah. But like, you know, it's fascinating. But yeah, there is nowadays, especially in my generation, people who have fandom lore and knowledge, like at least a few dots in it if it were character sheet, without being part of fandom. So yeah.
I wonder which edition of Enchanted Duplicator.
I could ask, yeah.
Possibly the one that you printed in Amazing.
Could have been, or it could have been any one of a half dozen others.
I do want to mention that we have 2 different editions of the Enchanted Duplicator in the auction. So you can guess yourself. And you didn't do a very good job of selling Riverside Quarterly for the auction. So you mentioned the one issue you had that's going to be in it, but then you said it was dull and stuffy. No, it was a fascinating, scintillating, devastatingly deep, insightful, and worth every penny of the $10 minimum we're going to put on it.
Well, I will say this one is actually possibly more interesting than some of them because it has Alexei Panshin on Robert Heinlein in. Quite apart from
That's
Leland
interesting.
Shapiro blasting Sol Cohen for
You know, that's
reprinting.
funny because there's
old-
2 issues of speculation up there, and one of them also has a chapter from Heinlein in Dimension.
Well, there you are.
We should do the.
Having said that, there's one thing that I want to kick around. I'm honestly not sure whether this is just the bubble effect of me enjoying writing people by people who think similarly to me, but in general, most sort of left-leaning fan writing I tend to find more enjoyable than stuff I know by fans who are on the right. I mean, the only person I've just been spending the last 5 minutes trying to think of a right-wing fan writer whose writing I really enjoy, and the only person I can come up with is the late Peter Weston.
Dean Grinnell.
Sure, there must be more, but
Greg Calkins. Greg Calkins had a very right-wing point of view, but somehow remained amiable, you might say, in his writings. But more to the point, when you stayed away from politics, he was a very enjoyable fan writer.
oh well, the same goes for Peter Weston and probably for other people
I
as
would
well.
say Greg was a much better fan writer than Peter Weston.
Oh yes, yeah, but
I was thinking also of Dean Grinnell.
yeah, I was about to just mention Grinnell, but both Grinnell and Calkins, again, correct me if I'm wrong, at the period of their highest prominence as fan writers, didn't tend to really touch on politics much.
No, the only thing that came up political in that era, and that was mostly in the pages of Warhood in the early 60s, was the whole nuclear thing.
Yeah,
Willis on one side, maybe F.M. Busby on the other, something like that.
well, that was all due to Heinlein, of course. I do remember the piece you mean because it's reprinted in Warhood 28, and it's one of the few times where Willis actually put the gloves on and came out fighting, because
Yeah.
Willis was not a feuder at heart, but he really, gave Calkins a drubbing over that one.
And I would suggest, among other conservatives who are band writers, my old buddy Greg Bender. Now, I don't think he was that conservative when we were doing Void together. He was still in college. He has become significantly more conservative over the years. So he calls me up on the phone several times a month. I try to keep the talk away from politics.
This
Well, I
is-
will give him credit, he's anti-Trump.
This is interesting in the sort of sense, do you find yourself dividing his writing from pre-conservatism to like post-conservatism?
No, it's more like all of Greg's fan writing occurred before he became very conservative. So
Yeah, I find that people's writing skills actually diminish after shifting in that sort of sense.
He went from being a fan writer to being a professional writer, and I don't know that his skills have diminished at all in that respect.
Yeah.
I mean, he's still writing books.
In anarchist zine culture, we actually talk about this in the sort of sense of, for example, one of the classic cases was discovering Bob Black, classic case in anarchist zine culture, who would write these sort of post-left anti-work sort of like zines or whatever. And was very well known for this, and then was discovered to be an FBI paid narc, who basically busted, he was a lawyer who busted legal opponents in the left by reporting them to the ATF or to like the FBI for like growing poppies or what have you. And when this was discovered, it became this whole deal of discussing like, well, how much of his writing do we throw out now? And so it became a sort of like, well, when did he launch his first work with, when he wasn't involved with the FBI, and when did he start working with the FBI? And so there's this general rejection in that zine culture of anything that happened now that we can trace when he first started snitching, quote unquote. And so that's generally all rejected, but the things before that is just like, oh yeah, positive. It's funny because in communist circles, people have arguments about young Marx and old, like latter Marx.
Right.
And so it just sort of seems in that similar way. And I've talked to people in the South too, who are lefties in fandom, and they tend to view like their favorite conservative writers as either having like their period of less conservatism versus more conservatism. So yeah.
Well, something about the left versus the right that I've noticed is in fandom at least, the reputation that the left wing have for being humorless and stodgy is completely, it completely holds false when you look at left wing fans and fan writers and so forth, because fanishness, fanishness and humour and wit all go together with the left wing attitude, from what I can see, and
it's surprising when you find a real right winger who can get into fanishness.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I mean,
I think maybe Bob Lehman. You ever read any of
the Vinegar Worm, yeah.
I mean, he made a tremendous impact when he had fandom, because he was another adult who hit a fandom that was largely adolescent. And he was immediately welcomed as an equal by all the BNF writers of that day. But subsequently it came out that he was pretty right-wing.
Well, I mean, an example I was thinking of was Rotzler, who took to using a rubber stamp on some of his outgoing mail, saying "Vote for Ike, he's been sick."
Oh, yeah.
And his local postmaster saw these stamps and absolutely flew into a fury and basically tried to have Rotzler prosecuted and banned from sending any mail, which, is a fine example to me of how the left wing has humour and the right wing just doesn't get it. Again, obviously there are difference. There are exemptions to both of these individual cases, but
indicates that as well. The left wing gets the jokes, the right wing says this is deplorable.
But what's also interesting is I have particular insight on this because my my co-editor, one of my co-editors for Lake Geneva was right wing, quote unquote. But because I find that fans that are right wing have to have really weird right wing views to really mesh with fandom. Like my friend James is a monarchist, so like, and he's one of my best friends, and you know I've constantly ridiculed his belief systems and everything, but you know he's definitely fanish, just doesn't go to conventions, reads zines, you know, reads fanzines and everything like that, and was a co-editor on my fanzine, and you know it's funny because I remember having a discussion with him of like, look, you can't write about monarchism in here, and then he was just like, don't worry, I'll just write about Tolkien, and like, which was to him the closest thing to revealing his political beliefs, and yeah, but it's funny because the like right wing that I've been most able to get along with in fandom ascribe by really weird right wing views that aren't necessarily bigoted but are just strange. Yeah.
Well, perhaps the elephant in the room, not Cecil Bennett this time, the elephant in the room here possibly is Heinlein, of course, because whilst Heinlein, you know, his politics and his extremism are obviously well known, if you actually study the man's views, you find, you know, they weren't actually typical.
He was like,
Yeah, he was very much his
complex.
own man, you know, and if you look back into his history, certainly if you read the recent scholastic works about him, you know, you find out that as a younger man he was, you know, surprisingly different to the one who fandom became familiar with later.
Yeah, young Bob versus old Bob.
There is a theory that his politics evolved with his wives.
Yeah, and frankly I agree with that from everything I've read. It was a Virginia Heinlein.
But if
turned
you
him-
actually read his fiction, starting with Beyond This Horizon, which is incredibly NRA oriented, you know, every person should carry a gun, that way everyone is free. You know, his politics in many respects, I mean, he was libertarian before he was right wing.
Oh, go ahead.
The gun thing doesn't seem to have as like clear left-right vision as one would think, because there are a lot of left-wing people who are like, we shouldn't let them disarm us, you know. But Heinlein was just such a weird mix. Like, I didn't know until Farah tipped me off that, you know, Starship Troopers doesn't have any white characters.
No, Johnny
Like
Rico is a
none.
brown kid.
None. Yeah, Filipino. Yeah. But it's pretty. He was pretty subtle about it. Probably had to be to get it published, but he did a lot of stuff that isn't in line with the sort of low-level assumption that he's, you know, he was kind of right libertarian.
He wasn't that doctrinaire, that's the thing.
Yeah, he was a complex
That's
man.
possible.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's really
way of putting it.
Heinlein had a huge influence on me when I first started reading science fiction, and it was fascinating because, like, you mentioned Starship Troopers. That was heavily influential on me because it was the first time of me seeing a protagonist that wasn't, you know, just automatically a white man, and so I thought it was fascinating, and it was just all revealed in like the span of 3 words, basically in a sentence, and I was just like, wow, world of difference to, like, you know, like a preteen who's
I think
first
some
getting
of
into
his
this sort of stuff.
previous juveniles also had non-white
Yeah,
protagonists.
I mean, I later found this out later because my going into Heinlein was watching the horrible movie and then reading the book. But, and then I read Stranger in a Strange Land, which completely changed my life. And it had like a huge influence on me.
His too.
Oh, yes. But I remember speaking to someone in another side of fandom who was telling me that he was one of the hippies who made a pilgrimage once over to Bob Heinlein's house. And Bob Heinlein basically yelled out of his window to tell them to go the fuck
They
away.
turned the fire hose on.
No, he was just yelling out of his window apparently. And he said it was really weird because we were all tripping on acid and we just thought, wow, our guru really hates us.
Well, I think from what I
That was
understand,
a hermetically sealed house.
Heinlein used to get lots of weird fan visitors, apparently, and I believe from having read his letters and so on that he thought this was routine for writers. I think it may just have been the fact that he was Heinlein.
Yeah, it's what happens when you have complex views on everything.
But Heinlein, as with, probably, the majority of the human race, his political views tend to sort of, became more fixed and more extreme with age. Joy Hibbett used to call this, hardening of the mental arteries. That as you get older, you get more set in your political views and more out of tune with the zeitgeist.
I'm not sure that was exactly what was happening. Aside from his having the brain blockage in Kansas City in '76, but I believe that there was a personal evolution towards ever greater self-indulgence in his attitudes and in everything. I see this reflected in his later fiction. Kind of climaxing with no time enough for love, whatever.
Yeah, time enough for love.
An epic masturbation fantasy involving him fucking his mother. That's what the whole book is about. And it's all that it's about, but it's done in every possible permutation. And, the Heinlein of the 40s could not even have conceived of writing that book. The Heinlein of the 40s was a man who was really interested in writing, who took on new writing challenges with nearly everything he did. When he wrote Universe, that story, I read, it's a novella really, but it was published as a complete book by Dell in a abbreviated paperback edition, is how I first read it. And I read the whole thing without realizing it until I'd finished. It's told entirely in dialogue. There is no narration at all in the entire book, and that's a tour de force.
Oh yeah, I mean, quite rightly, I think, fandom loved Heinlein because Heinlein was a born writer. But, going back to Kansas City, the Heinlein who gave that speech that Dan Stefan was notoriously interrupted, he couldn't have done that in the 40s.
I want to reel us away from Heinlein, please. About 10 minutes ago, it occurred to me when you were talking about the curious nature of right-wing beliefs in the people that you feel comfortable with in fandom. I think that what all of the people that we've been describing have in common is what we call in fandom insurgentism. A sense of skepticism about institutions, organization, and a sense of whatever your convictions are, you are the underdog, and you are going to have to fight to make your views known in the sea of mediocrity in which you swim.
Yes.
And although there are people
a strong anarchistic streak.
Yeah, I think everyone in fandom eventually has an insurgent experience, even if you are a very true fanish person in your attitude, or you're very Circon, or there are lots of other things that you value in fandom. You eventually reach a point where you feel like an activist response is required to something that's happening around you.
Yeah.
And I think that whatever kind of mundane political posture we bring to fandom eventually provides a venue to radicalize us.
Absolutely, and I feel that conventions in general, the first time I explained a convention to a non-fanish in any particular way anarchist friend, he said it was the very definition of a temporary autonomous zone. In the sense that, he was just like, fans have been doing Burning Man before Burning Man, basically. Without the burning, sometimes. I just mentioned Sasquatch, but yes, I mean, it has always been a sort of, great anarchist experiment in that, there is no central authority of fandom, and anytime someone tries to be,
and speculation
doesn't work out.
It doesn't work out. There's an insurgency that usually happens against it. Anyone tries to dominate, say, the Hugo Awards, like they did recently, there was an insurgency against it in which basically a united front erupted against the puppies.
Science fiction by its nature is about things being different to how they are in the world as we know it. And if you read science fiction and find that it appeals to you, you must have the kind of mind that is able to, at the very least, imagine things being different to how they are. And then the obvious way to get from how things are now to how they might be is by insurgency, be it left-wing, right-wing, libertarian, anti-libertarian, or some other axis on the chart, I don't know. But yes, I think it's entirely reasonable.
Cool, I think Mary's next.
I just have an observation, and that is that right-wingers tend to be very dogmatic, my way or the highway, and they're very boring, and they don't write well, and, nobody wants to read anything that they've written. I certainly
Terry Jeeves, yes.
But, because they are so dogmatic, and they, that this is the way it is, and they've got blinkers on and they don't see anything else out there. Fans, including right-wing fans, the ones that are open, they're seeing other things too, that's the insurgency, they see other ways of things working.
Well, it's fascinating because especially with like the weird right-wingers that I'm able to talk to, it's like we diagnose the symptoms, but we have different cures. And so I'm able to connect in that sort of sense to them. But generally what I find out of like the general milieu of like right-wingers who try to be in fandom is that they generally use it either as an excuse to push a particular political agenda, or are just really bad at what they're trying to do. And I wouldn't ascribe it directly to the politics, mind you, though like having bad politics also ties into like producing bad work sometimes. But I've always wondered why there is that correlation of just like bad writing, including bad politics, but yeah.
There's no flexibility with dogmatic people.
I would like to remark upon the history of New York fandom. Because I think it exemplifies a great deal of what you're talking about. We can start in the 30s with the rift between the left-wingers and the right-wingers that led to the Great Exclusion Act and the First Worldcon. And the Futurians, who went on to become the dominant fans turned pro of their era, Dave Knight, Fred Bull, all the rest of them. And then you get into what became pretty much known as the fractious 40s, in which fan clubs sprung up overnight, schismed, fell. I mean, generally speaking, there were at least 4 fan clubs in New York City in the 40s, but they were rarely the same one for several years running. And there were just so many factions that by the early 50s, different New York City factions were bidding against each other for the Worldcon, which of course meant that none of them got it. It wasn't until the second NICON in 56 that they had a unified bid. So the way they could get it, because previously every time somebody came up with a valid bid, somebody else from New York would come up with a counter bid. That would sink it. Well, all of this stuff, I came to New York City in 1959, and I thought all of this stuff was pretty crappy. There was just an incessant amount of low-level politicking that was of interest solely to the participants and turned off everyone else, and just gave New York City a kind of a bad smell. And I tried out the local clubs when I showed up. I tried out the Lunarians, my God, long, boring business session, dominated by Belle Dietz of all people. I tried the Newark group, who put on an annual open meeting. They were called ESFA. They were Sam Moskowitz dominated. There was the Metrofan. The Metrofan were sort of the young kids of New York fandom, and that club disintegrated in a dirt clod battle in Central Park.
Wow.
So, but there was one club that barely hung into existence, which is the Futurians Mark II. They had reformed around 1958. Basically, I'm not really sure who was around. Maybe people people like Donahoe. But by the time that Sylvia and I got to New York City, there was a fellow named John Clausen who was holding meetings that were attended by Sylvia and me, Perdita, who was not yet Boardman, and her infant daughter at that point, Karina, and maybe one other person. And the meeting consisted of Karina chasing John's cat into the plaza. And things were dire. Well, we tried building up the Futurians, because the Futurians was the closest thing to a Fanish club that existed. It only met once a month, which I thought was insanely slow. The Losses met every week, and the Washington DC group met every other week, or at least twice a month. And it seemed like there was no momentum in this club, Futurians. Well, we had just come to New York City. As we came to New York City, most of the people we knew in New York City, like the Ellingtons and Donahoe, moved to Berkeley. So we're sort of starting afresh. And various other people who had just come to the city, like Pete Graham and the Lupoffs and others, we formed a stronger Futurians. But the Lupoffs weren't real happy with some of the people who came to Futurian meetings, because the Lupoffs in those days were Nixon Republicans. They were proud of the fact that they too were a Dick and Pat. And, you know, and they worked for, or Dick worked for IBM. And
I hope there's some punching in this story.
they
got to the punching.
had a penthouse apartment. I mean, all the rest of us had scruffy apartments, walk-ups. Theirs had an elevator. They had a working fireplace in their apartment. They had a balcony around their apartment. I mean, this was a whole class higher than the rest of us, except for the Silver Group. And they objected to what they saw as the scruffier, unwashed people who were coming to the Futurian meetings. Now, one of these people was a fellow named Peter Stamford. He went on to be in the Fugs and the Holy Modal Rounders, and then he married Don Woolheim's daughter and became an executive vice president of Daw Books. And he's a really nice guy. I've smoked dope with him many times. But the Lupoffs, in their straight incarnation, took deep offense and decided they wanted to stop hosting the Futurians and start a new club. And this is the important part, because the new club, there were 6 of us who were founding members: the Lupoffs, Larry and Noreen Shaw, and Sylvia and myself. And we formed the Fanaclasts. And Bill Myers gave us our name at our first meeting, which was attended by people like A.J. Bowders and others. And the whole concept of the Fanaclasts, and this was my doing, was that there were no officers, there were no dudes, there were no business meetings. There was none of that crap.
Not even past presidents?
No, we haven't thought of that yet. But what we did say was that everybody in the club had to be friends. That you kind of accepted who the initial group of people were, but anyone new who came in had to be approved by the group. One person could blackball a prospective person. Now, I have to say that no one ever was blackballed, except maybe for Fred Phillips. And that was unanimous. But Fred Phillips was a local guy who was famous for saying, can I get in if I pump my ish? And we kept saying no. But he was socially obnoxious. It was very hard to be around for more than 10 minutes at a time.
Yeah, thank
But
you.
the whole concept of the anarchistic approach to a club was at that time unique to New York fandom. I mean, they all had officers up until then. And even the Futurians.
That's interesting. It's also interesting that it happened in the context of basically the situation in the US in the 50s and 60s, and also like just flat out US government action, was forcing some of the more left New York fans to go elsewhere. We wound up with Judy Merrill. We wound up with Chan Davis. Judy chose to come here. Chan Davis basically got run out of the US by the House Un-American Activities Committee. He founded the Harvard Science Fiction Club. He was one of the guests of honor at the 2004 Worldcon because of that. But he did 6 months for funding a pamphlet critical of HUAC and got blacklisted, and his wife got blacklisted, so they wound up.
Early 50s.
Yeah, they wound up at the University of Toronto. And
I hadn't finished my point.
Sorry, okay, like
Yeah, I
do
was almost
continue,
there, too.
okay, cool.
And that is, that as an anarchistic group, we've successfully bid forward, put on a World Cup. And it didn't break us up, it didn't fracture us in any way. We were a stronger club after the World Cup than before.
That's unusual and impressive.
And after that, they all moved to different cities.
Well,
happened?
some years after, I mean, World Cup in '67.
The effects
I
were
left in
slow.
70.
I'm surprised you were stronger. I mean, after running a NASPIC, I pretty much considered caffeinating from everything, but thankfully I'm still here.
Well, I personally ran the Nikon 3, and it was a lot of work, but it felt good, because I did it exactly the way I wanted it done. I had a lot of ideas and opinions about how things had and had not been done in the past, and I wanted to put my ideas to the test.
Yeah.
And I believe they were a success, Mike Resnick, to the contrary notwithstanding.
Understood. You know what's interesting is I was thinking about this sort of crossover while you were talking about sort of like, you mentioned this sort of like insurgent streak, and basically fandom tends to be like a coalition and crossover of weirdos from other communities as well, is what I've noticed. In particular, I was thinking about someone who is actually like a personal political and like other sort of hero of mine, who was involved in Baltimore fandom from like the 50s onward, in particular Star Trek fandom, and his name was Rafi Sharif Bey, and he was involved in all sorts of weirdness and would write these like Star Trek zines and everything, and help found like the Starfleet.
I don't think he was in Baltimore fandom in the 50s.
Well, he was probably more involved in the fandom because he was in the 50s. He was still in the Navy. He was involved in it later on, from what my research had done. Yeah.
It consisted of about 4 people, one of whom was George Wetzel.
Yeah, I mean, this was later on when he got more involved in it, but I know he founded like a Starfleet ship there and everything like that. But what was interesting is he was also well known by my anarchist friends there for helping found the Wobbly group there, Refound actually, and so in his time he was doing that. He was also a Jewish convert to Islam, which is also really weird, and so he was heavily involved with the Islamic community there, and not just that, but because he was still considered himself Jewish, he was still involved with like Jewish radical groups there, and also involved with like IWW, involved with like Star Trek fandom, involved with like underground political zine culture, and all sorts of like random crossovers. But he would go to conventions and stuff like that, and I think what's funny is that doesn't seem too much like the exception in fandom. It seems almost like the typical. In like this weird crossover that we constantly have, whether it's like one thing that we cross over with. Some of us, you know, have a weird affinity for things called sports, and then some of us had like a weirder affinity for things called politics, and so, you know, but they cross us over somehow.
It was jazz and sports cars.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Well, we're back here to Jack Spear's theory that, you know, all fans have something wrong with them, and it's just a question of finding out what. I mean, going back.
It's the handicap theory of that.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned John Brunner earlier, and John Brunner, obviously, you know, he was, you know, very much, you know, into CND and, you know, that sort of thing. He came from the family that founded ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries. He was incredibly posh. He had you know, right from his first encounters with fandom, the first thing anyone knew about John Brunner was that he was very posh by British fanish standards, and I think that gave him a lot of difficulty throughout his period, both as a fan and a pro, in relating to fans.
So fans resented that.
Oh well, they didn't quite know how.
There were other aspects of his personality they might also have taken.
Oh, I'm sure they were, but certainly a significant segment of it was his upbringing and his being perceived as of a higher social standing than the average.
So would you say that part of Peter Weston's perpetual issues with John Brunner was that he was a class traitor?
I wouldn't necessarily go as far as that, but certainly Pete Weston's fanzine Prolapse Oblique Relapse, there was a hell of a lot of material about John Brunner in there, and
Very little of it favorable.
but yeah, a lot of it interesting, but no one ever quite managed to find out just why, given the family that he came from, why he was perennially, rather hard up, and didn't seem to be able to call on any of the family riches. And I don't think anyone ever has managed to unravel that particular knot. But again, certainly from the upbringing that he had, to find him going on to compose the CND theme song, it isn't what you'd expect.
I think we're also out of time for this particular panel.
Actually, yeah.
Okay.
Can I do I wanted to say that despite my wisecracks earlier, I was a fan of class after Ted had moved out of the city. And because of my experiences being in fan class, when I was one of the people that helped start a group in Seattle, which was called, and still is, Vanguard, we took the fan class model. And it's survived all the since 80-something.
And a lot of people have no idea that that's the case, but we've always, but they agree immediately, and there's never any effort to change it.
And the group did host several conventions, although not Worldcon.
No.
Well, I am delighted to know that it has proved to be a viable model.
So I guess closing remarks.
Well, the only closing remark I really have to say is that Fanish politics is far too vast a subject to be contained in the margin of this panel in 1 hour.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, here's to luxury, fully automated space communism.
Post-scarcity communism.
Yep, post-scarcity. All right, I guess thanks everyone.
Good panel.